Because I actually also am part of this, informally part of this network of bloggers who write about the Toronto Raptors, and so I have to keep on top of these things. So I kind of missed the whole football game, but I found it very difficult to find myself cheering for Ray Lewis in the Super Bowl. Last week we talked about economic growth. We talked about getting rich. I guess it's entirely appropriate given we just talked about NBA basketball, NFL football, and the contract Joe Flacco was about to sign. We were talking about getting rich last week, and we looked at it from two different perspectives. In one sense, we're looking at getting rich as a function of individual effort. Right? The sort of Weberian / Smithian understanding of getting rich. It's a function of individuals, it's a function of individual rationality, it's a function of individual rationality in the context of natural markets. We also looked at it from a different perspective, and that was to look at how systems work. Political economic systems, to understand, for instance, that individuals or firms or governments all work within a larger system of political economy. And that in order to really understand how to get rich, how to economically grow, one really has to understand these sorts of phenomena within the context of systems. So in many ways, in a very crude way, we talked about getting rich. And getting rich, I think, in many ways is a proxy for this other concept, and that being this notion of development. And what I want to talk about today, or at least begin to introduce us to, is the question, and indeed the concerns we have about why some countries become rich and some countries stay poor. Or put another way, why we see uneven development. Last week, we talked about Adam Smith, we talked about Friedrich List and Alexander Hamilton, and they seem to provide for us all the answers as to how one can get rich, and yet the fact of the matter is, the reality is that development continues to be uneven. So then, before we start, it's important to ask what the question, it's important to ask the question, what is development? In a very general sense, we can think of development as progress. That is to say that one's condition at time 2 is better than it is at time 1. There is some notion of progress. Another way of thinking about it, in a related way, is that development is about transformation. That societies or economies, or even as individuals, we become transformed. That we are fundamentally different at time 2 than we are at time 1. Now, in the broad field of development studies, which is a strain of political science, many of you who study political science may go on to study the politics of development, for instance. Certainly is an area in economics as well, in terms of development economics, but there are many different dimensions to what we mean by development. One area, for instance, and one that is increasingly in vogue, is this idea of human development. That really what we're interested in is not so much about nations and countries, but rather we're interested in the micro level. We're interested in humans. Human security, for instance. And when we talk about human development, then we're really measuring things like people's health. Are people healthy? One of the things that I'm going to be doing at the end of this month is I have to go to Taiwan to do a little bit of research, and I'm going to be spending 4 days in the mountains on the east coast of Taiwan shadowing these mobile health units because I'm really interested in Aboriginal health in Taiwan. One of the interesting things, little Taiwan, one of the interesting things is that life expectancy for those living in the mountains of Taiwan are about 13 years shorter than those living 100 miles away in Taipei. So Taiwan is a rich country, but on an individual level, we see these disparities in terms of human development. So we look at things like health status. We look at things like literacy. We look at data like infant mortality rates, for instance. The number of children who die before the age of 1 or before the age of 5. Another way of thinking about development is thinking about it in terms of equity. One of the most popular measures of economic development, for instance, and we're going to look at this data throughout this course, is looking at GDP. And if we want to do a little more fine-grained analysis, we'll look at GDP per capita. On average, how much does the person earn? Or how much does the person have within a society? When we think about it in terms of equity, then what we're really looking at are the distributive consequences of development. Who gets what? Who gains and who loses? So here, for instance, we'll look at the distribution of income. What do the richest 1% earn on average versus the bottom 1%? Or the top 20% versus the bottom 20%? We may also look, instead of distribution of income, we may look at another measure called distribution of wealth. We've come to learn that income, for instance, is a pretty crude measure because lots of people earn lots of money in lots of different ways. And so a better measure, for instance, of inequality is not to look at how much money you earn on the books, but rather to look at how many cars you have, how many houses you have, the value of your real estate, and so on. And that's a distribution of wealth measure. We might look at, for instance, life opportunities, right? And social mobility. One of the things we know, for instance, in the United States now, once lauded the land of opportunity, intergenerational mobility is on the decline. Meaning that statistically, if you are born into a poorer family, in all probability, you will stay poor. The notion that you can climb out of poverty or climb into the higher socioeconomic groupings within a society such as the United States is beginning to decline. We may look, for instance, in terms of equitable development along the lines of gender or any other social cleavage. Gender, religion, communal politics, race, geographic location, and so on. So here we're primarily concerned then with the distributive consequences of development and the transformative capacity that entails, not so much on aggregate economic growth. Another way of thinking about development is in terms of capacity. Right? Capacity to, for instance, upgrade, to improve your station in life, to upgrade your nation's economic profile. So when we look at capacity, we'll look at, for instance, skills acquisitions. Is there an education system that ensures that 100% of its population is literate? Are there universities training, for instance, students to take on technical jobs, be it in the engineering or the sciences, or the social sciences and humanities to teach critical thinking and so on? Do we, as a society, in terms of development then, provide the transformative capacity for individuals and indeed for nations to upgrade, to develop, to progress over time? Another dimension in terms of development is sustainable development. Here we're interested in the longer term. We're not interested in these near-term fixes, right? So one of the ways in which we think about sustainable economic development is now to think about development vis-a-vis the environment. How sustainable are 19th century models of industrial expansion? How sustainable are 19th century modes of energy? How sustainable is this long-term in terms of our ecosystem, but also in terms of economic and industrial growth? Another way of thinking about sustainable development is diversification, not just ecologically, but also in terms of our industrial profile. We probably don't want to be an economy that is going to be selling agricultural products forever. How do we diversify our industrial profile so that we can sustain economic development over time? Just as an interesting side note, we one time had this young PhD come in to give a job talk. We were interviewing for new professors in our department, and he was showing export profiles and export profile data from around the world, and he had a scatter plot that was, very sophisticated. But what was quite interesting was, he says, there must be something wrong with my data because Canada is right next to Venezuela. I said, no, actually, you don't have anything wrong with your data because it's in fact true. Canada is a primarily resource, commodities dependent economy. And so Canadian policymakers are thinking very seriously about this over the long term. Is this sustainable? Is this something that we want to be in the business of doing forever? That is essentially extracting commodity resources from out of our ground and selling it to global markets. Another way of thinking about development is political development. And here, when we talk about political development, we're talking about democracy. We're talking about human rights. You'll remember back in the first semester we discussed modernization theory. How do you create an economy that then creates a sort of social modernization, and this social modernization leading to political modernization and democracy? So these are all different dimensions of development, but today I want to focus on, just for the sake of argument, and we're going to unpack this over the next several weeks, but for today I want to focus on aggregate economic growth. It is but one dimension of development. It's probably not even the most accurate measure of development, but it nonetheless is a critical one. And it's one, frankly, that is the lingua franca of development studies. You work at the World Bank, if you work at the United Nations, if you work at CETA here in Canada, aggregate economic growth is the main indicator that we look at. But more specifically, what I want to focus on today is how do we explain that some countries are developed and some countries, which you read about this week, for instance, Zaire, remain undeveloped. Despite or notwithstanding the very convincing arguments that Smith and List make, the fact of the matter is there are some rich countries out there, and there are some very poor countries. And if you look at the aggregate data, the rich countries are getting richer, and the poorer countries are getting poorer. So what I want to do today is to try to explain this variation. Why are some countries more developed, and why do some countries remain less developed? And we're going to do this by looking at theory. Right? After all, this is political science. We're a little light on the science, but we like to believe it's a science, and we do that by looking at theory. And if you recall, theory basically provides for us three things. The first thing that theory does is it helps us explain. Right? We want an explanation. Why are some countries richer and some countries remain poor? In explaining, theory also then allows us to predict. We have a theory about how the way the world works. We can look at the data, we can look at these cases, and we can make some predictions. This country will remain rich, this country will become rich, this country will stay poor, for instance. And third, theory then allows us to prescribe. Helps us explain, it helps us predict, and indeed, then it helps us prescribe. If you're a poor country and you want to become a rich country, then you should do X, Y, and Z. So to shed light on this question, then, how do we explain uneven development around the world, we're going to draw on different theoretical vantage points. The first one, again, just to very briefly review, is Adam Smith. What I want to do in the next few minutes, basically, is to have a conversation. As if Adam Smith, Friedrich List, and Hamilton, and Lenin were all having a conversation with one another. It would go a little something like this. For Adam Smith and the cosmopolitical view, as we know, his argument then is that the invisible hand of the market should reign. That there are natural supply and demand curves. And we presume that supply and demand are relatively stable, and as long as we do that, the intersection, as you recall from last week, the intersection of supply and demand is the optimal price. This is how markets work. This is the market logic. And therefore, as David Ricardo says, a disciple of Smith, under a system of purely free commerce, we read this last week, each country naturally devotes its capital and labor to such employments as are most beneficial to each. This pursuit of individual advantage is admirably connected with the universal good of the whole. So Adam Smith explains how the world works. It works through the invisible guiding hand of the market. And for him, that's the best way to predict whether a society will be successful and developed. And therefore, as Ricardo does here, he prescribes. If you want to grow your economy, and if you believe in this particular theoretical perspective, then the key is specialization. Just do what you're good at doing. Don't try to do something you're not good at doing. Don't try to acquire skills in an area that is unnatural to you. Do what you are good at doing, and we will have a natural division of labor globally. And as long as everybody does what they're good at, and as long as we then have free trade, so that we can trade these goods and services, then we will have an efficient global economy. And if we do that, and if we follow the Smithian prescription, this will lead to global economic productivity. Everyone will be productive. And if everyone is productive and they're all making something that somebody else wants to buy, then they will be prosperous. And if everybody is prosperous, then we will have peace. The key point here is the cosmopolitical view is one in which the global economy works in positive sum ways. Everybody gains. Everybody wins. As long as you are individually efficient and you allow the market to reign. Now, as you know, the mercantilists, people like Friedrich List and Alexander Hamilton, List the German, Hamilton the American, they say, look, Adam Smith, you may be right. Your notion of markets being efficient, that could be correct. But what you are expounding, Adam Smith, is the view of the hegemon. Of course you believe in the invisible hand of the market because you happen to be English. And the English happen to be the most dominant economy in the world right now. And the English are the ones that are making all the high value-add industrial goods. And you would then consign the Spains and the Portugals of the world to simply make wine to service you. For people like List and Hamilton, just a review from last week, nations matter. It's not just about individuals. Nations and countries matter. As List writes, and we reviewed this last week, all England, if Adam Smith was to be believed, all England would thus be developed into one immense manufacturing city. Germany would scarcely have more to supply this English world with than children's toys, wooden clocks, and philological writings. There are two key points that I want to stress in what Friedrich List is writing here. The first, again, is that, first and foremost, it's about countries. He's talking about England, and he's talking about Germany. That's his main unit of analysis. And the second point here is that this global or cosmopolitical system that Adam Smith describes, List interprets as unequal. It's not positive sum. In fact, it's a negative sum world. That one gains at somebody else's expense. And that the benefits to be accrued from this cosmopolitical system that Adam Smith so eloquently describes, that the benefits to be accrued are disproportionate. Some will benefit disproportionately at the expense of others. So then the solution, right? Again, theories help explain how the world works. They have some predictive value in how the world will work. And the solutions, as Alexander Hamilton writes here, very eloquently, to maintain between the recent establishments of one country, that means the United States. Remember, he's writing at a time shortly after the American Revolution, and America is a very young, economically backwards country. To maintain between the recent establishments of one country and the long, mature establishments of another country, by which he means England, a competition upon equal terms, both as to quality and price, is in most cases impracticable. It's impossible. For Adam Smith to sit there and tell you, don't worry, just make what you're good at, and the terms of competition will be completely equal, Alexander Hamilton is saying is impossible. The disparity, he writes, in the one or the other, or in both, must necessarily be so considerable as to forbid a successful rivalship. In other words, you can't have real competition. America can't compete with England without, he says, the extraordinary aid and protection of government. Right? So Hamilton is basically saying here, look, America is an infant country. It's just been formed. It has no industry. It's primarily an agricultural economy. It can't compete with England. It can't possibly compete with England on equal terms without the extraordinary aid and protection of government. So from the cosmopolitical view, the prescription is free markets. From the mercantilist view, the prescription is the visible hand of government. And we talked about this last week. What does the visible hand of government do? The visible hand of government, according to the mercantilists, is to create comparative advantage. In essence, it is to disrupt nature, if you will. For Adam Smith, the global economy is a state of nature. Nature has bestowed upon the Portuguese the ability to make great wine. Just make great wine. The United States has been bestowed upon with the great virtues of producing wheat. So just produce wheat. But what Alexander Hamilton is saying is, no, we want to produce industry. We want to create new comparative advantages and indeed to disrupt nature. And so we talked about different ways in which government has helped countries throughout history grow their own industries, to create new industries, to compete, if you will, and not just accept the natural division of labor. And we talked about different examples last week. The use of the Zollverein in 19th century Germany, exchange rate manipulation with post-war Japan, the creation of tariffs in 17th century England, and so on. The key point for the mercantilists is you have to distort the market. You have to distort the market in order for economies to grow. There's a third view lurking in the background here, and one that we haven't talked very much about, and it's the Leninist view. So Lenin is sitting in this conversation listening to Smith and List argue back and forth, visible hand of government, invisible hand of the market, and so on. And Lenin is shaking his head, basically saying, you're all so naive. Leninist theory is inspired by Marx. Marx, whom you've all been introduced to earlier last term. But in many ways, Lenin is a corrective to Marx. You see, Marx basically, in Marxist theory, predicts the end of capitalism. As a theory, Marx says that the internal contradictions of capitalism, that is to say the exploitation of labor, will eventually, inevitably result in a proletarian revolution. There will come a time when the proletariat, the workers, will revolt and overturn the capitalist system and result in communist revolution. Lenin was different. Oftentimes, Marx, Leninism are lumped together, but Lenin is actually fundamentally different because Lenin's theory is in fact a theory of international relations. He really does have something to say to Adam Smith's cosmopolitical view and Friedrich List and Alexander Hamilton's mercantilist view. Lenin argues, and it says here, imperialism, which is what he's worried about. Imperialism is the substitution of capitalist monopolies for capitalist free competition. So unlike Marx, he doesn't predict proletarian revolution and the end of capitalism. What he in fact sees is the emergence of capitalist monopolies. Monopoly, as he says, is exactly the opposite of free competition. So Adam Smith will say, no, look, we just need free trade. As long as everybody competes, then we will have efficient markets. Lenin is saying, no, monopoly is in fact the opposite of free competition. Monopoly, which grows out of free competition, does not abolish the latter, but it exists over it and alongside of it. and thereby gives rise to a number of very acute, intense antagonisms, frictions, and conflict. What Lenin means here is that this naive notion, or as he would put it, this naive notion of free competition and capitalist competition is eventually overtaken by monopoly capitalism. And so what Lenin argues is that as capital continues to grow, as firms become larger, as the capitalist class becomes richer, capital, by which he means money, capital needs to expand. That's the basic insight of Lenin. As these firms, for instance, the Dutch East India Trading Company, this is not a tiny firm, this is a massive firm. It is a form of monopoly capitalism. The British East India Trading Company. These are all forms of monopoly capitalism. They will continue to grow, and as they grow, they will need to expand. And that, for Lenin, is the basis of imperialism. So Lenin, therefore, then predicts that as capitalism gives way to monopoly capitalism, and again, fill in the blanks here. Dutch East India Trading Company, British East India Trading Company, Hudson's Bay Trading Company, Walmart, whatever. As capitalism becomes monopoly capitalism, it naturally has to expand. And therefore, it naturally goes transnational. And so for Lenin, then, he predicts, or he is seeing and predicting further, that monopoly capitalism, this ultimate stage of capitalism, leads to colonial expansion, imperialist ambition. So that then you have the English government in cahoots with English monopoly capitalists expanding into its colonies. And expanding not only its governmental apparatus, but also expanding labor and also expanding finance capital. So for Lenin, as he says here, you still have free competition in the sense that the English East India Trading Company wants to demolish the Dutch East India Trading Company. But over and above it, they begin to expand, and they begin to take over colonies. And for Lenin, therefore, then, this is the basis of imperialism and colonialism. You've all read Lenin. So hopefully now you have some sense. What he is really critiquing, what he is really describing, actually, is the global capitalist system. And his argument basically is that monopoly capitalism necessarily requires the expansion of capital. It requires the expansion of firms, of banks, and indeed of countries. And this expansion necessarily involves violence. It necessarily involves coercion. And all you have to do is just think about any colonial society and think about how you actually install a colonial government and how you manage a colonial regime. You can understand what Lenin means by this violence and indeed this global inequality. This Leninist tradition inspires what will eventually be called world systems theory, a more sort of contemporary version, if you will, of Leninist theory. It's a descendant in many ways of Leninist theory because it's really looking at the consequences of imperialism. Basically saying, okay, finance and global capitalism have had to expand. This is why we see European colonialism throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America in the 19th century. Fine. But what are the consequences of this then?